Thank you for joining us for this conversation on meeting this moment by pushing the boundaries, teaching, learning, and leading change in the world of K-12, higher education, and more. We are joined in this conversation by Rahim Rajan, Deputy Director of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who leads their digital work around digital transformation, courseware, and more. We're also joined by Stacy Caldwell, who's the CEO of the Mastery Transcript Consortium, one of the most interesting and progressive and innovative consortium projects in the world of K-12. I'm going to let her unpack that a bit as we go through this conversation. And Tom Vander Ark, who's the CEO of Getting Smart. Tom will be here in a bit. We are fighting through some tech challenges as he's trying to get on the platform. I'm Mark Milliron, the Senior Vice President and Executive Dean of the Teachers College at Western Governors University, and just thrilled to have you both right now in the conversation. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely pleased to be here.
Yeah. So part of this conversation is us unpacking both the challenges and opportunities of educators across K-12 and the world of higher education and beyond in meeting this moment. And how folks are innovating through these challenges and actually pushing the boundaries and thinking about what we're learning now, what we might want to bring forward. There is little doubt this is probably the most massive disruption we have ever had in the world of K-20. 80 million learners across the K-20 spectrum have been disrupted in their learning over the course of the last 6 to 7 months. In addition to that, we've also experienced massive social justice challenges that have shined a pretty bright light on digital equity challenges, in particular in the world of education. And it's led to just a lot of dynamic, difficult, and sometimes insightful innovation from folks as they've really taken this on. So where I want to start with this conversation, and I'll turn to you, Rahim, quickly, is this: one of the challenges we've had is a challenge of conflation. And by conflation, I mean people are beginning to conflate the emergency remote learning that people had to do with the 20-year experience of online learning that people have been doing since the late 1990s. I mean, the classic line is, remember, online learning was innovative in 1996, 1997. I mean, this is not something new, and people have devoted their lives to doing this incredibly well. And it's totally distinct from the life rafts that people have had to jump on. You're trying to compare life rafts to speedboats. I'd love for you to talk a bit about how and I think you talked about this in one of our earlier conversations, the people who've been at this for a while were ready, right? Because they had they actually gone through this process. They understood how to develop this kind of piece, but a lot of other folks have really had to jump in with both feet and conflating the two is a real problem, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a huge challenge for a number of different reasons. One of the simple reasons is that if people begin to associate the life rafts with that high quality digital learning experience, we absolutely run the risk that that's what becomes kind of normatized as the standard. And right. That is absolutely not the standard, right? There are organizations, practitioners, scholarly journals, platforms, technologies that have been around for multiple decades that have been pushing the boundaries on this, and all kinds of new innovations, right? New technologies, new innovations, simulation-based software, AR, VR, et cetera. So the cycle of innovation is moving very quickly, very rapidly. It might even be moving faster in this current environment, but we should not confuse, getting students onto a video conferencing platform with high quality digital learning, which has structured rubrics, where there's the learning science infused into the curriculum or into the faculty practice. Those are very different things. And I think that if anything, right now, I think there's a growing opportunity and a growing recognition that, this is actually doable, just in terms of, what people's initial kind of biases were or blind spots were. The current state and the reality of having to do this has forced people to confront their biases against digital and really confronted that, actually, no, there is such a thing as good digital learning, just as there's such a thing as good face-to-face learning versus bad face-to-face learning. So I think that's actually really important and really exciting to see that playing out right now.
Yeah, that and Stacy, I know in our earlier conversations we were talking about this idea that the worst of this is people. One is because there is radically unequal access to these digital tools. We are seeing some really uneven experiences of remote learning, where high wealth kids are actually experiencing some pretty deep, rich learning experiences, leveraging next generation learning tools, and people in remote areas are often, basically doing worksheets in plastic bags, right? It's a very different remote learning experience, and that kind of equity is a real challenge, isn't it?
It certainly is, and I think that I think this these last 6 months have really sort of shown, you started here, have shown really the best and the massive challenges. And so going back to a couple of Raheem's points for a minute, I think what's super interesting here is, Raheem, you're completely right that we have really good processes and definitions and standards around what good digital learning looks like. But I think if we broaden the conversation a little bit, what I think is most hopeful about what we've seen over the spring and into the fall is schools starting to really broaden their definition of where learning happens and really think about that a little bit more broadly. And so learning really doesn't have to be constrained to the four walls of the school. And I think we've all known that. But what we see in the best of cases is schools taking a step back and saying, okay, well, really what we need to do is make sure that we've got sort of clearly defined credits, competencies. Students need to know what they need to learn. They need to know that there are a range of vehicles to get there, be that a digital learning experience, hopefully a high quality one, be that an emergency digital set of criteria, be that a teacher or a coach who can get on and help them virtually right now explore their own opportunities to go pursue this. And so I think, when I think about the best of this, I think if we can all shift our definitions to learning happens everywhere, and how do we think more about really supporting those authentic learning experiences and an authentic sense of evaluating what students know, I think we're going to end up in a much better place. Yeah. Now, Mark, to your question about the inequities, I mean, I think what we see is, at the same time we have some schools doing exactly that work, we also have schools who frankly are just struggling to make school happen. And so we're seeing vast different experiences for students. I think we've got a long way to go in terms of funding and supports to make sure that all schools can start to transition to really supporting students pursuing their passions and thinking about what it is that they need to do in whatever venue is sort of most appropriate for them.
Yeah. Raheem, when people look at kind of the fundamentals of some of the online learning work that's been happening, there's, I always talk about the 3 C's, right? The people who've really begun to do this well really focus on how do you connect students leveraging whatever tool or technique or technology to the best content possible, right? And now we know there are unbelievable content repositories out there to help unpack almost any topic, and even in-depth kind of contextual ways. And the second is connecting people to context, actually understanding it in context and allowing them to get into those simulations and into those kind of real world experiences that might help the learning come to life in some pretty rich ways. And the digital side allows you to take the people out of the classroom they typically would be in, right? Wherever they are, and take them to what that context might look like. And then there's this whole community connection where you can use digital tools to create community. You can get students connected to each other, students connected to the teacher, students connected to a community of learning beyond their classroom, beyond their school, really into kind of the essence of that. But a lot of this is about the fundamentals that people have learned in this process. You and your work at the Gates Foundation have really been working with a group of innovators, the WGUs, the UCFs, the ASGUs. What are you seeing around, the lessons they've learned and how they've been able to kind of serve as mentors and guides to other people in this process? Because people have been scrambling, kind of trying to reach out to the people who are kind of the pros at this, right? Raheem, I'm not hearing you.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Somehow I got muted. It's a great question. I think that, one of the things we're seeing, and it's kind of an obvious thing, is that investment and scale matters, right?
Yeah.
Institutions that have been prioritizing this, that have been on a journey over the last decade, maybe some of them longer than that, right? they've learned an enormous set of things through constant iteration and practice and experimentation and improvement and refinement and investment. And so when we think about whether it's just the quality of a learning experience or some of the infrastructure that is required to support faculty, to convert a course, to build a course, accessing content, right? Like evaluating the content, figuring out if the content is aligned to the curriculum outcomes of that program. There's such a wide array of things that, a number of these institutions have been innovating on. And, I think what's exciting is that 10 years ago, those institutions were at a much earlier stage of that journey. And so today, what we see is that, the progress that they've made is actually helping to build just not a digital learning experience, but an entire digital infrastructure, right? So when you think about the broader student experience, when you think about connecting learners to supports, student supports, advising supports, when you think about the flow of data across the entire enterprise, I think the true innovation is actually the connections going out from the digital learning stack to the entire enterprise to build an entire profile of a learner across a journey and an experience, and then being able to innovate and support that learner in multiple different ways, right? Whether it's helping them register for a course or get the kind of needs and supports they need for financial aid registration or the kind of tutoring that they might need. There's such a wide variety of supports that learners have, and that investment that these institutions have made has enabled them to be able to serve the whole student, the whole learner.
And that's where it's been real a have and have not world. The institutions that have invested in an infrastructure for digital infrastructure to support learning and a digital infrastructure to support student service, right, and outreach, they've been ahead of the game because they've been able to be nimbly kind of move in to support that. Tom, welcome to the conversation. Tom, glad to have you in. We were just talking about this challenge of the conflation challenge of people assuming that the kind of the emergency online learning they've experienced is actually what online learning is, and the realization that this can be done well, and there are folks out there who have done it well. And part of this is this kind of mass orientation to online learning is people getting a vision in their head of what a crawl, walk, run looks like to build a learning infrastructure, to build a service infrastructure. Now, Tom, you've been a part of that for the last 20 years. You were on the original board of WGU. You've seen like some of the crazy ideas that have become commonplace. Talk a little bit about what you've seen in this moment, because clearly there are the have and have-nots between the people who've been ahead of the game and those who are really struggling to get up to speed, right?
It's interesting. It's to be careful what you wish for. The blessing and curse of what we're doing now, video conferencing, has been an interesting challenge. Millions of kids have successfully learned online over the last 20 years, and the addition of Zoom has been really interesting. Zoom and other video platforms, Teams and others, it resulted in many schools assuming that they should just run video school.
Yeah.
And they're trying to run in high school a 7-period day, and it makes a bad high school experience like a really bad video. It's unbelievably awful to watch. And my granddaughter just came by after her video kindergarten, and so this is an example, I think, of misusing a tool of trying to do school via video. Instead of being thoughtful about a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous work, and taking advantage of the fact that kids now have flexibility in time and place, and actually taking advantage of that and inviting them to engage in active and authentic learning where they are as part of a day that includes but isn't all about video.
Yeah, it's that whole idea that you're trying to be learning centered, right? Here's the learning you're trying to engage, that you have now time is variable, resources are abundant, figuring out how you can maestro those together and curate the kind of experience. We've often said that the least interesting thing about Western Governors University is that we're online. Like our model being competency based, asynchronous, heavily driven by deep relationships with mentors and connections with faculty and on demand course instructors. I mean, that model is just distinct. And we have learned a lot in the last 20 years about how to roll this out. And part of this is, I think people are going to be, a lot of very creative people are now learning some of these lessons, and they're doing it because they have to, right? So Stacy, you're a part of a consortium that is, the Mastery Transcript Consortium has really been about this idea of challenging at the very fundamental level the transcript, right? The idea that grades at their core are reductionistic. They reduce learning and actually put you somewhat in chains around the kind of instructional innovation you want to be able to layer out. It must be interesting for you, because I'm sure people are turning to you and and the work of the public schools and the private schools that are part of your consortium to learn, especially about how do you do learning and how do you do assessment differently if you're not held to the traditional classroom or traditional grades.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so, just to give a little bit background on our organization. So as you mentioned, the MTC is a growing network. We're about 340 public and private high schools right now who are transforming the high school experience, and frankly, transforming it in ways that line up really nicely with what you just talked about in terms of what WGU does, and introducing a digital high school transcript that really truly tells the story of each student's unique strengths, abilities, and interests. So the idea is, schools are working to redefine what high school can look like, and that could, and for all of them, that means let's build back from our portrait of a graduate what we think graduates of our high school should be able to do, and create a set of competencies or mastery credits, really define for students what it is that they should learn to do throughout high school, and those are both cross-disciplinary and sort of whole child. For most schools, they're defining a lot of the social emotional along with the actual skills and content that students need to be able to do. And 2 more seconds of background, and then we'll go into the what it looks like. Just to give you a sense for where we are, last year was our pilot year. So we had 4 high schools that used the Mastery Transcript as their transcript as they applied to college. And what that means is, instead of a traditional transcript, which looks like, we also can sort of remember, single subject course listings with a grade attached to it, and a sort of flat single sheet, to a mastery transcript, which is a digital representation that shows which of those mastery credits or sort of summative competencies that students actually achieved, with the ability to then drill down into the actual work that the student did to achieve that mastery. And we expect to have about 14 schools this year that are actually delivering those delivering those transcripts as part of their application process. So, we talked with over 100 colleges received transcripts last year, 85 will this year, or we saw about 85 letters of acceptance. We expect to, probably 400 to 500 colleges will start to see mastery transcripts this year. And I think the real focus for us was like, look, when you do the work to create a program that is exactly what you just talked about, Mark, that is, you do the work to say, hey, students should be able to pursue their passions. They should be able to figure out and define a project in the place where they are and actually take that on. They should be able to work internships. They should be able to solve a community problem. When you do that sort of work, to turn around and then try to translate it back into a single subject and a grade, really just, it doesn't tell the truth about the work that the student's doing. And further, it constrains what high schools are likely to do. Wow. So as long as we are saying, hey, the way that we credit students, the way that we fund schools, the way that admissions work is we need to see a grade on a single subject, and we're only going to credit based on Carnegie unit hours. Sort of those 3 are the 3 that really, if you hold those in place, you constrain education to look a lot like what traditional education is. So,
Raheem and Tom, I'd love for you to unpack, because what they're trying to do in many ways is remove a huge constraint across K-20, because that transcript transition is one of the biggest constraining factors between K-12 and higher ed, and actually from higher ed in terms of what they're accepting in and how they're kind of allowing people to transition in their learning. both of you have been powerful advocates of the idea of blending, right? It's not about one's better than, it's about we're better with lots of options for learning, right? And Tom, I'll let you go first, and then Raheem, I'd love for you to jump in this notion of blending everywhere. But Tom, I think you brought up this notion of the book, The Power of Place, and the fact that people are realizing that this isn't about doing everything online. This is actually about creating a curated experience that can probably bring in the best of all the things that might be at hand. And that place-based learning is still going to be really important in this, and we don't want to walk away from that. But it's about how you thoughtfully blend this kind of process. I want to make sure you go off mute, Tom. There you go.
It means unlocking learning opportunities anywhere, anytime, any place. So, how can we take advantage of the fact that every place is a place and has a lot to teach? And then how can we credential those learning experiences in new and different ways so that the local museum, the local library, the local business establishment, the local maker space can all be places where kids are not only learning, but where that learning can become credentialed and can eventually show up in their transcript. I think that's the future that Stacy and I are working for. And at the heart of it, Mark, the most important aspect of WGU is the advisor relationship, walking in relationship with somebody that knows you and your academic goals, a little bit about the challenges that you bring to learning with you, and is helping you co-construct a journey that makes sense for you, looking for ways to pack learning experiences into what's next for you, but also we think being creative about how you can credit and credential experiences that you're having both in school and out of school. And I think there's a big opportunity in this pandemic to get better on that front.
Yeah. Raheem, your thoughts on the blending of everything, right?
Yeah, there's so many things to say here, but one of the things that excites me about the vision, Stacy, that you laid out, right, is that historically we've seen, even just placement into post-secondary as an enormous cliff for a lot of low-income students, a lot of Black, Brown, Latinx students, Indigenous students, and so already we're seeing states, get rid of certain assessments in terms of placing, and people beginning to adopt multiple measures, high school transcripts.
It's amazing how quickly that happened in the pandemic. They suddenly, boom, got rid of that. It's like it's been this kind of forced innovation. It's like we've wanted to do this for a while, right?
Right, and all of a sudden, and I think that is absolutely the silver lining in this crisis, is that, I have a hypothesis that it's not going to be all digital, kind of what Tom said or what you said, Mark, but actually, it's not actually going to revert back to where we were. There are certain things in how we conduct educational practice, how institutions think of what is quality instruction. The needle has moved, the dial has moved. In higher ed, historically, we don't train faculty in teaching. We don't invest in faculty learning how to educate. And I think that as faculty moved to digital mediums, provosts, deans, chairs quickly realized, holy cow, we have to do something. We can't just give people Zoom and think that that's, instruction online. And so I think there's going to be a massive shift in both, what is considered normative practice, but also some of these innovations about deeper learning, about how we really measure authentic learning and skills. I really believe, we're going to see dramatic shifts that are longer lasting.
Stacy, in many ways, that's one of the bigger questions around the kind of what we're going to bring forward out of this. And one of the things that I think folks are going to bring forward is they're going to really be thinking deeper about how they can create different kinds of models for how they, plan for learning, measure learning, and kind of roll out of it. And it's got to be interesting. It's got to be pretty, in some ways, reaffirming of some of your early vision, because people are now kind of reaching out, like, how do we do that? How do we deconstruct and not only deconstruct, but build from the ground up the learning expectations, and then frame a very different kind of structure to be able to pull this together. It's got to be an interesting time for you in terms of cataloging catalyzing those conversations.
It is, absolutely. And I think your point around sort of the acceleration of the conversations that are already happening, I think is the right point. I mean, there's all of a sudden an openness across a broader range of institutions to really think about not only the sort of new forms of education and sort of learning happening everywhere that we've been talking about, but also marrying that with much more authentic senses of assessment.
Yeah.
So, Denise Pope, my favorite quote from her is, if we return assessment to the core, the Latin root is assedere, which is to sit next to. And if you sort of step way back from assessment and get out of our mode of, hey, assessment means a timed test that is typically multiple choice and that gives you a sort of specific numeric answer, and back that up to you're sitting next to, you're trying to understand, you as a learner trying to understand what you know, you as a guide or a teacher trying to help the student understand what they know. And if you start to think about assessment that way, you get to a much richer picture. And so you see things like, hey, a student could do a very traditional math assignment. But the practice of stopping and saying, okay, let's think about that assignment because you struggled with the first 3, then you got it on the 4th, and the last 5 were easy. That understanding of, hey, I actually got that concept is a much richer assessment and understanding for the student to have than the number, right? And so that's a very simple example. But I think if you start to extend that and think about the work that folks are doing around portfolio defenses and some of the work that has been going on in the Great Schools Partnership for a while around how to really think about consistent evaluation across proficiency work. Again, there's examples where people have sort of set the bar here and started to do the work. And I think we can start to transition into a much richer sense for how we know what students know when we're not trying to say the only way we know is an end of year assessment.
Yeah. Tom, I'd love for you to unpack something. I know you know this about Western Governors. You already kind of hat tip to this around our program mentor relationship work. We've really learned we are deeply student obsessed and analyze our data backwards and forwards and really unpack our conversations with our students in kind of deep qualitative. And one of the things that's pretty clear to us is there's kind of 3 buckets of challenges students bring. There are academic challenges where they really have to learn to master content. We're trying to help them overcome that. But there are clearly life and logistics challenges, right? Everything from housing insecurity, food insecurity, transportation. And we really work hard to keep ourselves low cost, use a bunch of OER, make sure we're trying to keep the costs in the right level because those life and logistics challenges really matter in terms of driving the learning. But the third bucket is really this kind of combination of purpose, social emotional learning, kind of the non-cognitive factors as people have called them. And it really is about that relationship building, meeting that student where they are and taking them to kind of bridge the gap between their talent and the opportunity. We always talk about WGU as a pathway to opportunity. Our job is to get you on that pathway. You have a new book coming out, shameless plug for you, Difference Making at the Heart of Learning. And I think a big chunk of that is this whole idea of meeting that student where they are and helping them go where they want to go, right? How learning can help them get there. You might want to just dive into that a bit.
Well, I do think like WGU, it starts with that advising relationship where you're walking alongside the learner and in conversation, helping them come to understand who they are as a learner, what their strengths are, what their interests are, so that it puts you in a position to co-construct that learning journey. We increasingly think that learning journey is about creating experiences that allow the learner to contribute, to make a difference, to do work that matters to them and to their community. Those experiences are particularly powerful because they not only build problem-solving skills, but they build agency, the confidence that you know how and where to act on the world. When you make a difference in your community or for your family or maybe a broader audience, it creates these memorable experiences that you remember for life, and it brings real sense of purpose to learning. And so we've come to understand as we've studied the future of work that this idea of difference making might be the superpower in the new economy. It's entrepreneurial mindset, right? Being able to spot opportunities and use design thinking to work with the community to deliver value. It's those new skills that we think are more and more important. And so we hope out of this pandemic, we see more schools making purposeful learning a real priority. A new way to think about personalized learning is not just the meeting a kid where they are in mathematics, but also sort of meeting them where they are in the life journey and doing more learning that matters to them and to their community.
Raheem, the work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in post-secondary and in college ready from the beginning has been about trying to help more and more diverse students be more successful than ever before, right? And the pandemic has probably opened the eyes of a lot of educators about the tools at their disposal to do that kind of work. We've waxed poetic about a lot of that kind of work and what could be done. But it also has shined a pretty bright light on digital equity challenges. We have a huge digital divide challenge in this country, and more people are talking about this in the terms they talked about the interstate highway system or the rural electrification projects, in that this has economic implications for people, it has healthcare implications for people, and it has deep educational implications for people. In fact, the early data is showing high-income kids have actually gained in their learning during the pandemic. Middle-income kids have kind of stayed the same, but low-income kids have begun to really fall off the cliff. And this kind of learning is kind of made the realization that if we want to make that difference so more and more diverse students can be more successful, we gotta take this on. We gotta tackle the digital divide. Talk a bit about what you're seeing in those conversations and the kind of work that's being done there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's a truth of the pandemic and in this moment that, the most vulnerable, those who are experiencing poverty, Black, Latinx, indigenous populations have been disproportionately affected. And when you look at students, when we look at enrollment patterns, when we're looking at which students are going back in the fall, which students didn't go back, didn't re-enroll, you absolutely see those same impacts. One of the surveys we saw recently that New America and Third Way conducted, 4 out of 10 students had to make purchases of some sort. Now, mind you, a lot of those purchases were hardware. 44% had to buy a laptop or, buy some kind of technology to help enable that. But 1 out of 5 had to buy a desk, literally just to study at home or wherever they were. 82% of the students that they surveyed said that literally staying motivated was their biggest issue, or finding a quiet place to focus, right? So the needs are vast. We see something like 9 million students right now either don't have access to a device or sufficient bandwidth. So in some ways, the pandemic has laid bare these inequities that were already there, but now those inequities are even more stark because the digital is the medium to access, right? So there are innovative things colleges have been doing, ranging from completely reorienting how they support students, how they enable access to hotspots, devices, et cetera, loaning services, loaning tablets, et cetera. But, not all institutions are quite there, and not all institutions have the resources to do that. And I think as a nation, as a country, it's time that we have this conversation about, is this absolutely, just part of the infrastructure that we need as a country to make sure the institutions, the schools, and the citizens have what they need to thrive in a new blended environment.
Tom, this is going to be, one of the real conversations happening nationally in the federal government, state houses, and in districts and in higher education circles over the course of the next few years. This is a continuity of service issue. This is because this infrastructure needs to get built out, it's going to give a whole array of different options for educators. Just talk a bit about how you see that kind of unpacking, because one of the things I'm really worried about is coming out of the pandemic, we might see some what I would call reactionary traditionalism, where people are like, okay, we're done with that. Let's go back to regular learning, right? And we have to fight that and just say, hey, no, it's not going back to regular. It's figuring out how we create better for more people, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting that just a year ago, a lot of us were patting ourselves on the back for what we thought we had finished the digital divide. We'd wired all schools, and we had become pretty close to one-to-one in terms of devices. But we have learned that 20 or 30 million American families really had little or no real Wi-Fi at home. And then it turns out that a lot of districts really hadn't distributed devices, and so there's a lot more digital inequity than we thought. Donna said in chat she thought tech companies could help solve that divide. Certainly, cable providers have a role. We've seen some of them step up with some pretty steep discounts. Tech companies, Chromebooks are a part of that really low cost last mile solutions. States can play a super important role, particularly in our rural communities, but school districts, with some support from states, just have to make it a priority to make sure that every student has a device and that they're working in partnership with their local municipalities to be really creative about last mile solutions. So that's hotspots, that's community Wi-Fi locations, that's strengthening your school Wi-Fi so that's more widely available in the community. Every community is going to have a little different last mile solution, but we've certainly seen this year that it's absolutely critical that every community build those solutions so that every family has access to continuity of learning, whatever the crisis.
And it's not just about making sure everybody can get on Zoom, right? I would encourage everyone who's listening, if you haven't read the book Fiber by Susan Crawford, it is absolutely worth the read. It was written pre-pandemic, and it will make you feel a little bit of envy for how other countries around the world have invested in their digital infrastructure. And this pandemic, I think, has made it crystal clear why we need to invest in it. Because, again, this isn't just about education. There are real health implications. There are real economic implications in terms of being able to stay working, being able to have access to economic opportunity. Stacey, as your consortiums have really wrestled with this, in many ways, there's a predicate for having this kind of digital infrastructure to do some of the unpacking work that you're talking about. Like the more and more people are going to need to make sure that these kinds of infrastructures, even just to use the transcript you're talking about, right? To be able that digital infrastructure becomes a must. So this, in many ways, is moving us from the paper generation to the information generation. So we can really kind of do the kind of things we're talking about. But that's got to be there, right?
It does, for sure. And I think it falls into the very, very necessary but not sufficient category, right? So all the challenges that Tom was just talking about, and the fact that what this pandemic did was actually just point out to us all the ways in what we hadn't actually connected folks in the ways that we should. And so yes, absolutely, we need to get there. That is sort of baseline. We need to get there. Everybody needs to be able to have good access to broadband Wi-Fi. Folks need to be able to get online for sure. And then, in addition to that, we need to recognize that there's a whole lot of other problems, right? And so the question around sort of folks not having a desk or not having a quiet place to study, I think that we've seen a number of examples over the spring and into the fall of how that's playing out and how the challenges are playing out. So I think the next challenge, certainly both for high schools and for colleges, but sort of speaking for high schools for a second, is also to think really broadly around that aspect of personalization. So what does it mean to actually meet every student where they are? What are the sorts of flexibility with assignments or the ways that students can actually take on different learning challenges and learning experiences to make sure that you're both giving students good opportunities, but also valuing the wide range of things that students are already doing. I mean, students are overcoming all sorts of challenges that we currently are just sort of ignoring, as opposed to really embracing as sort of a really big part of their tenacity and their ability to get things done. And I think having the ability to both recognize that and then start to show that, start to demonstrate that on a transcript, start to make that part of what they're doing, I think is super important. And then there's a whole other topic that we sort of hit on that I would love to dig back into a little bit here, which is, it falls into the same idea of giving students currency for the work they're doing. So thinking about credentialing a little bit more broadly, and Tom was starting to talk about this earlier, but thinking about really making the case for when students know how to do something, when they have built a skill, whether that's in high school or college, what are the ways in which we can make sure that employers can see that, future educators can see that they can take that with them and really move that along? Again, digital divide, necessary but not sufficient, right? It's the starting point.
A predicate for the innovation, and that's exactly. WGU has been leaning hard into the learning and employment record work, and that kind of open open content exchange is going to allow for that kind of, hopefully, like you said, the currency to carry through, right? Where we can create these, I call it K-20 plus, which is K-12 higher education, and then the employer-based learning world, right? That interconnection of all that, and then how do you take the learning through that? Raheem, in many ways, that's going to be, that's the coin of the realm here, because I think in the early days, I think I'd love for both you and Tom to talk about this. In the early days of the digital revolution, some of the simplistic arguments were the assumption that if you used more technology, you would improve learning, which of course is a nonsense conversation, and people figure that out. But the question now, the topic now is, how do you make the most of the broad infrastructure we have that includes place-based learning, but also deep digital resources? And then how do you take that learning and go somewhere with it? How do you create new infrastructures for sharing, like the learning employment record or the transcript work that Stacy's doing, right? This is where this is what we want to bring forward, is the urgency around this opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's so many opportunities, especially looking at where these sectors touch and rub against each other, and solving, a lot of the friction points in those transitions, right? So whether it's, moving students from, K-12 into post-secondary in a variety of different post-secondary pathways, right? Or how do we integrate, real skill building, work learning, internships into the post-secondary experience, so that students are actually, I think about the work college that Paul Quinn has created, right, under Michael Sorrell, where students are on an academic trajectory, but they're absolutely also getting real world work experience. And that is adding to the credentials value in a shorter amount of time, right? Because they're doing it in a blended or an online way. So I think there are so many opportunities to attack these inefficiencies at the seams of the systems and create better linkages in service of the learner, the learner's trajectory, the learner's velocity. If we're orienting around the student, we can solve those things. If we don't orient around the student, these barriers remain and we don't get anywhere.
Tom, you've been talking about this in some ways, Tom. In some ways, you got to be saying hallelujah, because you've been preaching this sermon since, for 20 years. And it's just, a lot of the pieces and parts are coming together now where some of this work can get done, right?
It's a little frustrating that's taken this long. I wish we were farther ahead, but this is jump-starting us. I just want to add a little color commentary around what both speakers have been talking about. We're really, it's inviting young people to begin to create and curate a comprehensive learner profile that includes a portfolio like the one Angela said she's doing with her kids, and then being able to permission that information to potentially interested parties like WGU and to employers. Mark, we're really excited to see this kind of work happening in Texas, and it's unlocking internship opportunities for young people, employment opportunities, and they're even receiving inbound college enrollment offers because they've permissioned their learner profile to colleges. So I'm really excited about those connections that are making. So don't just think of the transcript as a simple paper executive summary, right? It's a living summary of a comprehensive digital profile that we're beginning to see schools help learners create.
And I love the conversation here about the fact that as we continue to do this, it's the idea that learning is everywhere, right? As our kids are on vacation, they can go to a museum and literally have a digital docent experience and actually document that they went through museum and saw the pieces of art and X, Y, and Z. It really is going to be figuring out how we curate all of that. Matt, I'd love for you to come on, and if we have any questions coming out of the chat, we want to pull in to this larger group, we can jump into that. And then after that, I'm going to have you all kind of wrap up with a final words of wisdom for folks. So Matt, go ahead and share any kind of key questions the folks are asking us to jump into.
Will do. And Tom, I know you've answered a few along the way, so apologies if I duplicate any. Let's see. Do you think that the experience thrust upon us by COVID-19 and the ensuing shift to a more blended context is the beginning of a more foundational shift away from the older bricks and mortar K-12 experience?
Do you all want to say do you want to say yes in unison?
Well, I actually said yes and no. No, in the sense that for K-12, particularly K-8, the custodial aspect of school will remain important as long as we can see. However, even in K-8, I think we've seen the introduction of a much more expansive thinking about how school can be embedded in and partner with the community. So I think there's a yes and answer there.
Yeah, I would, my nuance on that is this notion of, I'm a firm believer in we have to honor the past as we move to the future. There are deep, long-standing truisms in education about the power of relationships, about the power of social emotional learning, about the power of the affective domain that are not going to go away at all. We're just going to have new tools and new resources to be able to inspire that kind of learning, document that kind of learning, provide currency to that kind of learning. That's going to be what's pretty exciting about it.
Mark, I got off the phone a few minutes ago with we had 40 Texas school districts, and there's a lot of interest in some of the extracurricular activities that go along with school. So I think we have to keep in mind that school serves a broad set of jobs to be done for communities in Texas and beyond.
Extracurricular, co-curricular, and all the rest, right?
Yeah.
Friday Night Lights.
Well, and I think we can't ignore the equity piece that we were talking about earlier, right? So yes, it's building relationships. Yes, it's the relationship building that also happens with extracurriculars and that sort of that students pursuing their passions. But then, in a world where some students have a private space to go to and study, and other students are sort of in a sort of very busy household and responsible for care, we also have to recognize that, sort of getting to a school building is an equity building exercise at some level too. And so, mine is yes, I think we will, I really hope that we continue to, sort of use the innovations that we're coming up with here and see the opportunity in them. But I think there's some very real benefits that the school building plays that it'll continue to play for sure.
Yeah, Raheem, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I just think that in so many cases, sometimes these institutions are setting a more level playing field, right? And they're addressing some of the inequities that are in the groundwater of our societies. And so, we can't discount that. At the same time, to one of the things we talked about earlier, I do think we're going to learn and become much more, hopefully, smarter about, when that in-person value is there and when that asynchronous or virtual or, alternative value prop is there. And I think that's going to, I think users are going to want that. I think learners are going to want that. I see that shift in behaviors where, students want to consume things, they want to engage in things based on their convenience, not based on the way it's, organized by the system.
I think the whole idea of trying to use technology to make human moments precious is a really important one, right? It's the idea of there are times when technology needs to get out of the way, but technology can actually help you understand when that time is and how to connect people, right? Everything from near peer software all the way up to other kinds of tools. If you haven't checked out Hope for College, hopeforcollege.org, and it's spelled hope with a number 4, hopeforcollege.org, is the Hope Center at Temple University, which is totally focused on basic needs issues within the world of higher education. And one of the key things they do is this idea of teaching teaching colleges and increasingly K-12 to understand early signal of when these are the challenges, and then how do you reach out right away? Because one of the things you find out is one of the things we learned when I was at Civitas Learning is almost half the people who leave their journey in higher education leave not because of academics, they leave because of other kinds of issues, and a lot of it's life and logistics. And
Right.
you're losing students, who are high ability students. Sorry, Stacy, they're 4.0 GPA, right? A 3.8 GPA, and it's just an early indicator. These are high ability students. They're not leaving. They're leaving because their car broke down. They're leaving because job challenges. In the K-12 world, they're leaving because their parents got divorced. They're leaving because they're now homeless, right? And that signal too becomes a really big deal. And there's some real innovation that can happen around that too, which is a pretty big deal. Yeah.
Mark,
So
do you have
go
another
ahead,
question?
Matt. Go
Yep.
one more, and then we got to wrap up.
Okay. This one is specifically for you, Stacy. Stacy, do you think the move away from SAT this year will open up more opportunity for a conversation around improving the transcript?
Absolutely. I think the broader conversation here is, how do we know what students know, and how do we think about showing quality, authentic measures of what students can actually do around the skills that really matter for the next set of opportunities. And so, you already see colleges engaging in this. So many colleges have gone test optional and test blind that, the conversation they're involved with right now with their admission staff is, okay, what are the range of new variables we're going to look at? And so you have a forced experiment this year. We are going to get a really, really rich picture of which variables, which sorts of information they actually can use in a consistent way to drive that forward. So I think out of this year, you'll see a whole lot of colleges and universities saying, okay, here's the range of data points that we can look at. And even for those that step back and say, you know what, I want to continue to include an SAT or ACT in the portfolio of things that I look at, I think the opportunity to say there is a richer set of information that they're also looking at, and less likelihood that people are doing quick cuts on an SAT and a GPA, but instead folks looking at a wider range of data points. I think that trend will continue for sure.
So some quick final thoughts. I mean, there are a whole array of educators across K through 20 plus out there that are wrestling with this combination of desperation and aspiration, right, of what's possible. Just some top line kind of words of wisdoms or thoughts for the folks that are doing this kind of work. Raheem, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm looking forward to seeing, and this will be retrospectively, is what are the new innovations that come out of this experience, right? So whether it's the sophistication of new technologies, it's the better use of those technologies and tuning that blend, but also I think the creativity that's going to be exposed in how leaders, teachers, superintendents, deans, presidents address student-centered learning experience, right? So I'm really excited about what comes out of the crisis in terms of those kinds of bold new innovations that completely change how we just do this going forward. And I do believe that out of this crisis, we're going to see some new things that we didn't see before, and that are going to permanently shift how we conduct education.
Love it. Tom, what are your thoughts?
Pay attention to advisory. That's what made WGU the great institution it is. There's nothing more important in secondary schools than a really powerful advisory system. It's critical for both social emotional learning, but it's also the place where you walk alongside a learner and help them co-create their learning journey and curate their portfolio and ultimately their transcript. So it's been important. The pandemic makes it more important than ever. I think it's the backbone of both secondary and post-secondary education as far as we can see.
Love it. Love it. Stacy, your thoughts?
My thought is, for parents, for students, for teachers, for schools, as much as you can in the middle of this, keep your eye on the opportunity and the opportunity for experimentation, because I think there's some really marvelous opportunities. One of my least favorite things that I continue to see in papers over and over and over again is, oh, we're going to lose a year of learning. Well, no, we might lose a year of in-school building activities, but that doesn't mean we need to lose a year of learning. And for students and parents to look back over their 12 or 16 or 20 years of education and say, hey, I had a year where what I got to do was step back, choose a really big project and dive into something in a way that I'd never gotten to dive into it before and do something really interesting. That's going to be one of their favorite years of education, and likely one of the ones where they learn the most. So I think to the degree that we can keep focused on the opportunity, I think there's some really good things that could come out of this year.
Yeah. I've heard it said we're probably going to see more change in the next 5 years than we saw in the last 25, just because of this forced experiment, as you guys have talked about within it. Just a final story. Tom, you and I talked about this. My daughter, I have 4 kids. I have a 22-year-old, 20-year-old, a 16-year-old, and an 11-year-old. So I'm living the K-20 experience right now. All of them were packed into our house during the early days of the pandemic, of course, during lockdown. And it was, in some ways, there's some serendipity in that, because I'm probably never going to get that amount of time with my kids, focused amount of time. And one of the projects we worked on is my oldest daughter, who's a rising senior in the College of Ed at University of Texas. We got together and decided to write a children's book. And the children's book is called The Sugar Chair. And the idea of the sugar chair is children learning to find their time to get in the sugar chair. And the mantra of the sugar chair is slow down, look around, figure out how to sweeten things up. And I think we're at a moment. Hopefully, we're going to be able to take as we're just wrestling with all this kind of aspiration and desperation, we can hopefully find some time to kind of slow down. And then look around, like Raheem said, at all the creativity and innovation and insight that has come out of this, and kind of learn from this entire process. And hopefully we as a community of practice, community of learners, can figure out ways to kind of make things better going forward, and kind of in many ways make the most of this moment, meet the moment with all of our skill and will. And I just want to say it's a huge thank you for joining us in this conversation. It could not have been a better group of people to be a part of. So appreciate it. And thanks everybody for joining us at the ASU GSV panel. Thanks all.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.